Imagine a scenario where every man on Earth has vanished except one. All 4 billion of them gone in an instant. One man remains as the sole male on a planet of 4 billion women. Most people think about this as some kind of fantasy scenario, the ultimate wish fulfillment. But the reality would be far more complex, far more disturbing, and far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Let's break down what would actually happen step by step, examining the psychological, social, political, and biological implications of being the last man on Earth. Immediate infrastructure collapse. Within hours of all men vanishing, critical infrastructure worldwide would begin experiencing catastrophic failures. This isn't speculation but inevitable based on current workforce demographics. Approximately 90% of essential infrastructure workers are male. Power plant operators are roughly 92% male. Nuclear reactor technicians are about 88% male. Water treatment facility workers are 85% male. The technicians maintaining cell towers, internet servers, electrical grids, and sewage systems are overwhelmingly male. When these workers vanish simultaneously, the systems they maintain would start failing immediately. Nuclear power plants would face the most critical situations. Many modern reactors have automatic safety systems that trigger shutdown protocols when operators disappear. However, older facilities, particularly those in developing nations, require active human intervention to shut down safely. The problem is distribution. While qualified female nuclear engineers exist, they aren't positioned at every facility worldwide. A plant might have 3 female engineers among a staff of 50. When 47 men vanish, those 3 women would face the overwhelming task of shutting down an entire nuclear facility designed for full crew operation. Some plants would manage emergency shutdowns successfully. Others would experience dangerous situations, radiation leaks, cooling system failures, incidents requiring weeks to resolve. The female engineers would ultimately manage these crises through extraordinary effort, but the initial hours would be precarious. Electrical grids would experience rolling blackouts within 6 to 12 hours. Grid management requires constant human monitoring and adjustment. When 90% of operators vanish, the remaining personnel would be overwhelmed. They'd prioritize critical systems like hospitals and emergency services, but residential areas would see intermittent power for days or weeks. Water treatment plants would struggle similarly. Some cities would see dramatic drops in water pressure. A few might lose clean water entirely until engineers could stabilize systems. Boil water advisories would spread across metropolitan areas worldwide. Internet infrastructure would become severely unreliable. Server farms require continuous maintenance. When most technical staff disappears, servers would crash with no one available to restart them. Major websites would go offline. Social media would become intermittent. Entire sections of the internet would be inaccessible for extended periods. The economic impact would be immediate and devastating. When stock markets opened, they'd trigger circuit breakers within minutes. This would be the worst crash in history, exceeding 1929 or 2008 by orders of magnitude. This wouldn't be a market correction, but the instantaneous elimination of half the workforce, half of all consumers, and half of all productive capacity. Male CEOs, board members, and middle management would all be gone. Some companies would have female leadership ready to assume control. Others would be paralyzed, with no clear chain of command. The global economy would be in freefall. However, society wouldn't collapse entirely. It would bend to the breaking point but not break. Women comprise significant portions of many critical workforces. Roughly 40% of physicians are female, 35% of lawyers, 45% of pharmacists, half of all biological scientists. Female engineers, doctors, police officers, military personnel, and government officials would work 100-hour weeks in complete exhaustion, sustained by adrenaline and determination. They'd keep essential systems functioning. Society would be strained, struggling, fundamentally altered, but it would survive the initial crisis. The grief pandemic, parallel to infrastructure failure, would be something even more catastrophic. The largest psychological trauma event in human history, 4 billion men vanishing means roughly 4 billion women losing someone they loved, often multiple people, all simultaneously. Every woman who had a son would lose him. Infants vanishing from cribs, toddlers disappearing mid-play, teenage boys gone, adult sons with careers and families, all erased in one instant with no explanation, no warning, no goodbye, no body to bury, just inexplicable absence. The grief would be incomprehensible in scale. Mothers losing only sons, mothers losing multiple sons, pregnant women experiencing spontaneous miscarriage as male fetuses vanish from their wombs. The trauma would be unprecedented in human experience. Every woman with a father would lose him. Loving fathers, absent fathers, abusive fathers, complicated fathers, all gone with no chance for final conversations, reconciliation, forgiveness, or closure. Just permanent absence. Sisters losing brothers, wives losing husbands, grandmothers losing grandsons, partners losing boyfriends they planned to marry, daughters losing fathers they were estranged from. The interconnected web of loss would touch literally every woman on Earth. Suicide rates would spike catastrophically. Within 24 hours, hundreds of thousands of women would take their own lives. By week's end, millions. Mothers who lost their only children. Women who lost husbands and sons simultaneously. Elderly women who lost partners of 50 years and cannot imagine continuing alone. Suicide hotlines would be overwhelmed to the point of uselessness. Mental health systems would be completely unable to cope. Therapists themselves would be grieving fathers, brothers, and sons, while trying to help others process identical losses. The situation would be psychologically impossible. Depression would become a genuine epidemic affecting billions simultaneously. The largest mental health crisis in history by orders of magnitude. Women unable to function, going through survival motions but not truly living, just existing in perpetual grief. However, another reaction would emerge. One society would find uncomfortable to acknowledge. Some women would feel relief, not happiness, but relief. Women who suffered abuse from husbands, fathers, or boyfriends. Women who lived in constant fear of male violence. Women who experienced assault, harassment, or oppressive male authority. For these women, the danger would be eliminated, the fear removed. They'd feel guilty about this relief. Society wouldn't approve, but domestic violence would drop to nearly zero overnight. Sexual assault would effectively end. The constant low-level threat many women experience daily would vanish. For some, this would bring overwhelming relief, even while grieving other men they cared about. The last man's discovery. The last man's realization of his unique status would likely unfold gradually over several hours. He'd probably wake to unsettling silence. In cities or suburbs, constant background noise is normal. Traffic, construction, people. But that morning would be eerily quiet. Stepping outside, he'd observe abandoned cars in streets with engines running and doors open. His neighbor's dog would sit confused on a lawn instead of barking. Calling male friends and family would result in voicemail for everyone. Eventually connecting with a female family member, his mother or sister, he'd encounter hysteria. She'd struggle to explain that men are gone, all of them, everywhere. His father vanished before her eyes. His brother, too. Every man she knows. Turning on news channels, he'd see the same catastrophe reported globally. Men vanishing worldwide. Security footage showing them simply ceasing to exist mid-conversation. One moment present, the next moment gone. Not fading like ghosts. Not walking away, just instantly not existing. The realization that he's the sole exception would take time. Initially, he'd assume others survived, scattered globally. But as hours pass without any other men reporting in anywhere, the impossible truth would become clear. Every man on Earth has vanished, except him. This would present a critical decision. Announce his existence or attempt to hide. Hiding would be nearly impossible in the modern surveillance state. Every city has cameras, many with facial recognition. Satellites can read license plates from space. Cell phone tracking, credit card records, and social media footprints would all reveal his location. 4 billion desperate women would use every technological tool available to determine if even one man survived. They'd find him within days, perhaps hours. Realistically, he'd need to come forward voluntarily. He'd likely post something simple online. I'm still here. I don't know why. I don't understand any of this, but I'm alive. That post would go viral within minutes. Within an hour, it would be the most shared content in internet history. Within 3 hours, his location would be identified through IP tracking. Within 6 hours, his house would be surrounded by thousands of people. News helicopters would circle overhead. Police would attempt to establish perimeters. Crowds of grieving, desperate, curious women would gather, wanting confirmation that men existed, that their sons and fathers and brothers were real and not mass hallucinations. Government agents, federal agents most likely, would arrive with polite but firm instructions. He'd need to come with them for his own safety. The crowd is growing. The situation is becoming unstable. Someone will breach the police line. Someone will do something regrettable. Protection is essential. He wouldn't have real choice in the matter. He'd go with them, leaving his house probably forever. They'd transport him to a military facility like Fort Meade, deep into underground bunker complexes. For his protection, they'd say. And they'd be absolutely correct, given what comes next. The psychological phenomenon. Within days of women beginning to interact with the last man, something completely unexpected would emerge. Every woman spending significant time near him would experience psychological and physiological effects they cannot control. This wouldn't resemble normal attraction. This would be something stranger and far more powerful. He wouldn't be merely rare or unusual. He'd be literally singular. The only man among 4 billion women. The only one. The human brain, shaped by millions of years of evolution in populations where men comprised roughly half of humanity, wouldn't be equipped to process this reality. It would create overwhelming involuntary responses that intensify with exposure. Female security guards assigned to protect him would experience this first. These would be highly trained military personnel, professional and disciplined, accustomed to maintaining composure under extreme stress. During their first days of assignment, they'd function normally, cool, professional, maintaining appropriate distance. By the second week, symptoms would appear. Hands trembling slightly when bringing meals, avoiding direct eye contact because looking at him feels overwhelming. Faces flushing when he speaks. Heart rates increasing measurably in his presence. These trained soldiers would experience involuntary physiological responses. By the third week, the effects would intensify. They'd think about him constantly during off-duty hours. They'd manufacture excuses to check on him unnecessarily. They'd stand outside his door during off hours simply to be near him, not attempting anything, just needing proximity. Their commanders would notice these changes and reassign personnel, not for misconduct, but because prolonged exposure makes maintaining professional boundaries psychologically impossible. This wouldn't reflect moral failure, but neurological response to an evolutionarily novel situation. Scientists studying this phenomenon would find it baffling. Female doctors conducting medical examinations would be completely professional during initial appointments, clinical, distant, focused. Second appointments would proceed normally with perhaps slight nervousness. By third appointments, their hands would shake when taking notes. They'd ask unnecessary follow-up questions to extend time with him. They'd find medical justifications for frequent appointments. They'd struggle to concentrate because being near him becomes psychologically consuming. This wouldn't be attraction in conventional terms. Many of these women wouldn't like him as a person. They wouldn't be romantically interested based on his personality or appearance. But the fact of his singularity would create irresistible pull, like gravity, like addiction, something primal bypassing conscious thought entirely. Necessity would force implementation of a rotation system. No woman could work with him longer than 2 weeks consecutively, not due to unprofessional conduct or inappropriate behavior on anyone's part, but because extended exposure makes maintaining appropriate boundaries impossible for anyone. This demonstrates how powerful the phenomenon of being literally the only man would be. The last man would notice these patterns, initially confusing while grieving his father and brother, and processing the overwhelming situation, he'd gradually recognize that every woman spending time with him begins acting differently. He affects them involuntarily, without trying. That realization would be intoxicating in dangerous ways. The power dynamic. Within weeks of being in custody, the last man would begin comprehending the true nature of his situation. That understanding would fundamentally transform his perspective. 4 billion women exist on Earth. Every single one needs him. Specifically, they need his genetic material for humanity's continuation. But he doesn't need any specific woman. He requires resources and protection. But those can come from any of them. They're individually replaceable to him. He's irreplaceable to all of them. This creates a power imbalance unprecedented in human history. Kings wielded power over subjects, dictators over citizens, masters over slaves. But those systems were always contextual and ultimately dependent on supporting structures. Enough people could overthrow kings, militaries could turn on dictators. But his power wouldn't be systemic. It would be biological, fundamental, unavoidable. He possesses something every woman on Earth needs for species continuation. Something that cannot be replaced, replicated, or obtained elsewhere. That makes him the most individually powerful human in history in a very specific but absolute way. He'd begin testing this power, not initially consciously but through small observations. He'd mention disliking the provided food, not demanding, just commenting. Within hours, someone would ask about his preferences. Within a day, a chef would be hired exclusively for him, preparing whatever he wants whenever he wants it. He'd comment that his quarters feel claustrophobic. Within 48 hours, renovation would begin on larger spaces with better furniture and amenities. Whatever makes him comfortable becomes priority because his contentment matters more than budget constraints, more than protocol, more than almost anything. He'd express boredom. Within a week, state-of-the-art gaming systems would arrive. Every movie and show available, books, music, whatever he wants. They'd scramble to provide it because keeping him unhappy represents a risk nobody wants to take. The pattern would clarify. He can request almost anything and receive it, not because people like him or because he's earned it, but because he possesses leverage no one else has. His cooperation is more valuable than gold, more valuable than oil, more valuable than any resource on Earth. This power would extend to interpersonal interactions. He'd notice how women react when he looks at them, really looks at them and holds their gaze. He'd observe them freezing, see their breathing change, watch them lose composure. A professional military colonel with combat experience could lose her ability to speak if he maintained eye contact too long. This would be genuinely intoxicating, addictive. The feeling of having such effect on people simply through existing, simply through looking at them. Most people would go through a phase of using this power, testing it, seeing what they could make people do or feel just by giving them attention. The temptation would be overwhelming, but beneath all this lies a dark truth. The vulnerability. The last man's power would be illusory, a dangerous illusion built on a foundation that could crumble instantly. He wouldn't be powerful, he'd be precious. There's a critical difference. His power would exist only because other women decided protecting his autonomy is important, that respecting his choices matters, that his consent is required. But if that consensus shifted, what could he actually do? He's one man. If a determined group of women decided to overpower him physically, he'd be helpless. If 10 women restrained him, what resistance could he offer? None. If they decided to sedate him and extract genetic material by force, what could stop them? Nothing. All his perceived power flows from security systems, from guards protecting him, from protocols being followed, from women who've decided his bodily autonomy matters even at extinction-level stakes. But if enough women concluded that forcing him was justified, that species survival outweighs individual rights, his power would evaporate instantly. He'd become the most vulnerable person on Earth, not despite his importance, but because of it. Because what he possesses they can take. The only thing preventing them is a collective agreement to respect his autonomy. And agreements can change. This realization would be terrifying. All that intoxicating power would be revealed as completely dependent on other people choosing not to exercise their power over him. The moment that choice changed, he'd be helpless, and that choice would begin being questioned publicly, on international television, in the United Nations. The international debate, within the first month after the last man's existence became known, once initial shock subsided enough for coherent discussion, global conversation would turn to an extremely uncomfortable question. What obligations does he have to humanity? Debates would begin diplomatically. Different countries would issue statements expressing hope that he'd choose to cooperate with genetic preservation efforts. Emphasis on hope, on choice, on respecting his autonomy as an individual with inherent rights. But even in these early, respectful statements, undertones would emerge. Phrases like, "We understand this is his choice, but consequences affect everyone." References to the gravity of the situation and unprecedented circumstances. Subtle pressure wrapped in diplomatic language. By month 2, statements would become less subtle. Countries would openly say things like, "Individual rights are important, but we must also consider collective survival." Opinion pieces in major newspapers would question whether any one person's autonomy can outweigh the entire human species' continuation. Philosophers on television would debate whether extinction-level scenarios create different ethical obligations. Religious leaders would contribute varying perspectives. Some would insist his body is his own, and forcing him would be a sin worse than extinction. Others would argue God preserved him for a purpose, and refusing that purpose would mean rejecting divine will. Every faith tradition would reach different conclusions based on their frameworks. By month 3, tone would shift noticeably. Frustration would creep into official statements. We respect his choice, but how long can humanity wait? Women's fertile years are finite. We're discussing decades maximum before the window closes entirely. Every delay year means fewer potential mothers. We need action soon. Some countries would be more aggressive. Authoritarian governments especially. China might openly state that individual autonomy has limits when species survival is at stake. Russia might agree. Various Middle Eastern countries might reference religious obligations, superseding personal choice. Democratic countries would be more cautious but would still begin hedging. We believe in bodily autonomy absolutely, but we also think serious conversation should happen about whether normal ethical frameworks apply in extinction scenarios. We're not saying we support compulsion. We're saying the discussion needs to happen. Scientists, ironically, would provide language making force sound reasonable. Medical professionals would appear on international broadcasts explaining procedures in calm clinical terms. Electroejaculation is standard medical procedure used on patients who cannot produce samples voluntarily. Spinal cord injury patients, comatose patients. We use electrical stimulation. The subject doesn't need to be conscious or consent. We could obtain necessary genetic material without any physical harm. From a medical standpoint, it's quite routine. Another doctor would add, testicular sperm extraction is another option. Surgical but minimally invasive. We'd use anesthetic. Extract sperm directly from testicular tissue. Very routine in fertility medicine. The subject would be completely unaware under anesthesia. No pain, no trauma, just a medical procedure for extraordinary circumstances. They'd be describing rape using medical terminology, making it sound scientific, reasonable, necessary, just a procedure, just treatment. No different from any other emergency medical intervention compelled for public health reasons. The comparison would be made explicitly. We quarantine people against their will to prevent disease spread. We mandate vaccinations in some countries. We conscript soldiers during war. We already accept that individual autonomy has limits when collective survival is at stake. How is this different, especially when the alternative is literal extinction? Counter-arguments would be passionate but would struggle for equal traction. The moment we violate bodily autonomy for any reason, we lose what makes us human. We become what we're trying to save ourselves from. A humanity surviving through rape isn't worth saving. We must maintain principles even at the highest stakes, or the stakes become meaningless. But polling would tell a troubling story. Initially, perhaps 65% of women globally would say his autonomy should be respected regardless of consequences. By month 3, that would drop to 55%. By month 5, 48%. Slow erosion of support for absolute bodily autonomy as extinction reality sets in. The first vote. Around month 4, the United Nations would hold a formal vote, not binding or enforceable, but symbolic and important. The question, should international law recognize compulsory genetic material donation in verified species extinction scenarios? The last man would watch proceedings from his bunker, unable to attend in person but with complete feed access. As countries cast their votes, results would be yes, 87 countries, no, 106 countries abstain, 14 countries. The no votes would prevail. He'd be safe, legally protected, his autonomy respected. For now. But here's what would be truly frightening. 87 countries voted yes, not a tiny fringe. Nearly half the world saying that forcing him is ethically and legally justified in their view. That species survival outweighs individual autonomy. That extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary measures. Geographic distribution would be telling. Most countries said yes. These aren't just authoritarian regimes, but countries representing billions concluding compulsion is justified. Most no votes would come from developed democratic nations, including collectivist ones. Abstentions would be countries genuinely torn, unable to reconcile principles with survival instincts. Some countries abstained. The vote wouldn't end discussion. It would intensify it. The shifting consensus. Over the next 2 months, the global conversation would undergo dramatic shift. What started as, should we ask him, would become, can we make him? What began as discussions about respecting autonomy would become debates about when autonomy ends. Public opinion would move measurably. Polls would show increasing support for compulsion. By month 6, roughly 60% of women globally would support forcing him to cooperate if he refused voluntary participation. A majority. A clear majority saying his rights don't outweigh species survival. Framing would change. Media outlets would stop using rape and start using terms like emergency medical intervention, compulsory genetic preservation, and species survival protocol. Language carefully chosen to make force sound like policy rather than violation. More scientists would speak supporting compulsion. I understand ethical concerns, but I'm a biologist. I study extinction events. This is what extinction looks like. We're facing our species' end. Every delay year means fewer potential mothers, less genetic diversity, higher catastrophic failure risks. From purely scientific standpoint, we don't have time for prolonged philosophical debates. Ethicists would be divided. Some would hold firm that autonomy is absolute. Others would argue consequentialist frameworks. I don't like it either. But if we're discussing preventing extinction versus respecting one person's bodily autonomy, I must weight those options. 8 billion lives versus one person's agency. That's not easy calculation, but one we must make. Religious leaders would cite precedent. Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac when God commanded it. Sometimes faith requires difficult choices. This man was spared when everyone else was taken. Perhaps he was spared precisely for this purpose. Refusing that purpose would mean refusing divine will. Increasingly, women would speak with personal stakes. I always wanted to be a mother. The dream died when men vanished. I'm 35 years old. I have maybe 10 fertility years left. Am I supposed to accept I'll never have children because one man refuses? Is that really how humanity ends? Because of one person's choice? These arguments would be emotionally powerful, hard to counter, and true. Millions of women facing death of motherhood dreams, billions facing species death, all contingent on one person's decision. The second vote, month 6. The United Nations would reconvene. This time the resolution would be more carefully worded, more legally sound, more clinically phrased. Resolution 2891. This body recognizes that in verified species extinction scenarios, where genetic material from a sole source is necessary for species continuation and where voluntary cooperation is not forthcoming after reasonable consideration time, international law shall permit compulsory extraction procedures under the following conditions: appropriate medical oversight, full ethical review board approval, psychological support before and after procedures, and regular necessity reassessment. Such extraction to be considered medical emergency procedure, analogous to other compelled medical interventions for public health. The vote would be watched globally. Yes, 124 countries; no, 69 countries; abstain, 14 countries. It would pass by significant margin. 124 countries just voted that forcing him is legally acceptable under international law. The resolution would give him 30 days to voluntarily participate in genetic preservation efforts. After 30 days, if he refused, compulsory extraction would be authorized. The language would be careful and clinical, but meaning would be clear. 30 days to comply voluntarily. After that, they're proceeding regardless. And it would be legal, sanctioned by international law, not called rape, called emergency medical procedure for species survival. The countdown. Those 30 days would be psychological torture of the highest order, the worst month imaginable. The countdown would be inescapable. Every news channel would display it. 28 days until enforcement as permanent graphic. Websites would feature countdown timers. Social media would obsess over it. The entire world watching as his autonomy ticks away day by day. Protests would erupt worldwide. Massive demonstrations in every major city. But disturbingly, both sides would protest, and they'd fight each other. One side, this is rape, his body, his choice. Bodily autonomy matters. We can't become monsters to survive. Other side, humanity is dying. Species survival matters more. One person versus 8 billion, do what's necessary. These protests would turn violent. Women fighting women in streets across every continent. London, Paris, Tokyo, New York, São Paulo, Sydney, Mexico City, everywhere. Police attempting to separate them, people getting hurt. Some protests would specifically support him. Women believing his autonomy is absolute would gather outside his facility holding signs. Protect him. Autonomy is non-negotiable. We won't let them. As if they could stop it. As if their presence mattered against international law and military enforcement. Other protests would be against him. Women angry that one person's choice prevents humanity's continuation. Selfish. Coward. Humanity matters more. Their anger palpable and understandable. Their motherhood dreams dying because he won't cooperate. World leaders would make statements, carefully phrased but clearly pressuring. We hope he makes the right choice. We hope he understands what's at stake. We hope he recognizes his obligation to the species that gave him life. Medical teams would begin preparing in multiple countries: United States, European Union, China, Russia. Multiple nations ready to conduct extraction procedures the moment authorization is given. Equipment assembled, facilities prepared, personnel trained. Everything ready for day 31 if he refuses. Legal frameworks would be finalized. Who performs the procedure, where it happens, who oversees it, how often it can be repeated, what constitutes excessive harm, every detail worked out, making rape legal and systematized, turning violation into policy. He'd watch all this from his bunker, unable to leave, unable to escape. Where could he go? Every satellite tasked with finding him if he disappeared. Facial recognition on every camera. 4 billion women searching, nowhere on earth to hide. The psychological pressure would be crushing. He wouldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Knowledge that in days they might sedate him against his will, strap him to a table, extract his genetic material while unconscious. All legal, all justified, all sanctioned internationally. Day 28, day 25, day 20. Each day an eternity. Each day bringing him closer to forced violation. Each day he'd consider options and realize he has none. Day 15, day 10, day 5. He'd have to make a choice, the only choice left. The surrender. Day 27, 3 days before enforcement. He'd request to speak with the senior official in charge. probably the UN Secretary General by this point, given the situation's international scope. He'd tell them he'll cooperate voluntarily under specific conditions. He'll participate in genetic preservation. He'll donate for sperm banking. But he maintains approval rights over distribution. He reviews requests. He decides who gets access and when. Not blanket permission. Not unlimited use. Controlled cooperation where he retains some autonomy measure. They'd accept immediately, relief visible, not because they care about his well-being, but because voluntary cooperation is vastly easier, legally and politically, than enforcement would have been. Within hours, announcement would go worldwide. The last man has agreed to voluntary participation in genetic preservation efforts under controlled conditions. Humanity has been given a chance at continuation. Global reaction would be mixed and complicated. Some women would celebrate in streets, crying with joy. Humanity saved, future secured, children possible again, species continuation guaranteed. Others would be angry. He should have given unlimited access. He's being selfish, maintaining any control. Just give us what we need and stop making conditions. Still others would be furious for opposite reasons. He surrendered. He should have forced them to follow through, should have made them face what they voted for, made them actually rape him so the world could see what they're willing to do. His surrender lets them off morally. But he wouldn't have surrendered to be noble or to save humanity exactly. He'd have surrendered because the alternative was worse, because they were going to do it anyway. At least this way he keeps some small control measure, some dignity, some say in how his body is used. It wouldn't really be a choice, it would be choosing the least terrible option from a menu of terrible options. But that's what would happen, because it's the only thing he could do. The program. Within 48 hours of his agreement, the program would begin operations. Medical facilities specifically designed for this purpose with state-of-the-art equipment and professional staff. Everything optimized for collection, storage, and distribution of genetic material. The first donation would happen within 72 hours. He'd be taken to a clinical room, everything sterile, medical, professional. Female doctors and nurses would explain the procedure, collection methods, how the sample will be processed, where it will be stored, how it will be distributed. He'd provide the sample. They'd handle it like liquid gold, which essentially it is, the most valuable biological material on Earth. Each sample containing millions of sperm, each sperm potentially a human being, his genetic code potentially repopulating the entire species. The sample would be processed immediately, evaluated for viability, concentration, motility, everything tested to ensure maximum success rates, then divided into smaller samples, each frozen to negative 196 degrees Celsius in liquid nitrogen, stored in secure facilities, backed up in multiple locations in case of catastrophic failure at any site. Distribution protocols would be established immediately. Who gets access first? Criteria for approval, age limits, health requirements, geographic distribution to ensure genetic diversity spreads across populations. Waiting lists would form instantly with millions of women requesting access. He'd review requests as his condition for cooperation. His maintained control. Each request would include information, age, location, health status, why she wants to become a mother. He'd have to decide, approve or deny, playing God with other people's reproductive futures. The decisions would be impossible. Approve younger women because they have more childbearing years. Approve older women because their window closes faster. Approve based on health to maximize healthy offspring chances. Approve based on geography to spread genes across populations. There's no good answer. Every choice means someone else waits longer, maybe forever if they age out, before approval. Within the first month, thousands of requests would be processed. Thousands of approvals granted, samples distributed to fertility clinics worldwide. Women would begin IVF procedures using his genetic material. Within 3 months, first confirmed pregnancies. A few dozen women successfully implanted with embryos created from his sperm. The world would celebrate these announcements, first children of the new era. First proof humanity can continue. Within 6 months, hundreds of pregnancies. Within 9 months, first births. Healthy babies. his biological children, half him, half women he'd never met. There would be photos, news coverage of first births, history being made, but they wouldn't be his children in any meaningful sense, just genetic offspring he'd never know. Within the first year, thousands of children born. Within 2 years, tens of thousands. The program scaling rapidly, his genetic material distributed globally. Fertility clinics on every continent. Women of every nationality, background, age, within viable range. All having his children. All contributing to humanity's continuation using his DNA. The toll, the psychological impact on the last man would be catastrophic in ways taking years to fully manifest. He'd develop profoundly disturbed relationship with his own body. It wouldn't feel like his anymore. His body would be a resource, a commodity, property of the species rather than himself. Looking in mirrors, he'd see not a person but a biological production facility. His value measured entirely in gametes produced. The isolation would be crushing. He couldn't have normal human relationships. Every woman he interacted with would be affected by the psychological phenomenon of him being the only man. Professional relationships impossible beyond 2-week rotation limits. Personal relationships completely impossible. He'd probably try at some point. Meet a woman. Try dating. Try having something normal. It would fail catastrophically because how could it not? She'd either be overwhelmed by proximity to him, losing ability to relate to him as a person, or she'd want him for what he represents rather than who he is. Or she'd be there seeking genetic access for herself. Or she'd constantly wonder if he chose her because he actually liked her or because she was convenient. The power dynamic would poison everything. He'd be profoundly alone, surrounded by people constantly but utterly alone. No one knowing him as a person. No one caring about him beyond his biological function. No genuine human connection. Just professional interactions ending before real bonds form. Just women wanting something from him. Just guards and doctors and officials whose job is managing him. He'd cycle through psychological phases predictably, though never in circumstances this extreme. Phase 1 would be the God complex. During roughly months 2 through 8, he'd feel special, chosen, fundamentally different. 4 billion women need him. He's civilization's most important person. How could he not internalize that as meaning something about his inherent value? He'd think he's better, more significant, that the universe chose him for reasons. Phase 2 would be the crash during roughly months 9 through 18. He'd realize he's not special, just a guy who randomly survived. His importance has nothing to do with merit, character, or anything he did. Just genetic lottery winner. That realization would be devastating. His inflated self-image would collapse. He'd feel meaningless, purposeless, just biological accident with vast consequences. Phase 3 would be anger during roughly years 2 through 4. He'd be furious at the world, at women, at humanity, at the situation, at himself for surrendering, at everyone benefiting from his genetic material without understanding what it cost. Rage at being reduced to function, at being valuable only for what he produces. Phase 4 would be attempted acceptance from year 5 onward. He'd try making peace with it, try finding meaning in helping humanity continue, try reframing his situation as noble sacrifice rather than exploitation. It would work sometimes, not always. He'd cycle back through earlier phases periodically, but gradually he'd find some equilibrium. Not happiness, but acceptance. He'd require intensive therapy throughout, but even therapists would struggle. They'd be affected by the 2-week phenomenon. They'd need rotating. Hard to build therapeutic relationships when therapists change every 14 days. And what could they really tell him? It's okay that your entire life was reduced to sperm production for species continuation. There's no therapeutic framework for this. He'd probably be medicated. Antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, maybe mood stabilizers. Not because he's mentally ill, but because the situation is so psychologically untenable that normal human emotional responses would be debilitating. Better living through chemistry, numbing himself enough to function. Years passing. Year 1 would be adjustment, the program running at full scale. Thousands of births monthly. infrastructure adapting to woman-only operation, society stabilizing into new patterns, the last man settling into his strange existence. The grief crisis would still be acute. Suicide rates elevated but declining from initial spike. Women starting to process loss rather than drowning in it. Therapy helping some, time helping more. But for women who lost sons especially, pain would never fully fade, just become manageable rather than all-consuming. The oldest children would be entering adolescence around year 10. His biological offspring, hundreds of thousands by now. Some would know he's their father. Most would want meeting him. He'd agree to some meetings. It would be surreal. Kids who look like him, share his mannerisms, carry his DNA, but complete strangers, raised by mothers he never met, living lives he has no part in. A 12-year-old girl might ask him directly, "Did you want to be our father?" He'd have to find honest answers. "I didn't choose this, but I'm glad you exist. I hope you have a good life." What else could he say? His biological children would number in hundreds of thousands. Most children born in years 1 through 10 when he was the only source. After year 10, numbers would decline as stem cell methods took over. But his genetic legacy would be enormous. Nearly an entire generation carrying his DNA. Schools would request visits sometimes, wanting students to meet the last man. He'd agree occasionally, standing before teenagers trying to explain what men were like, what the world was like when half of humanity was male. They'd ask questions like he's describing ancient history. In a sense, he is. Year 40. He'd be in his 50s or 60s, depending on starting age, older than chronological years suggest. Stress and isolation aging him prematurely, but he'd have survived, adapted, found some measure of peace with his impossible situation. The final reality. So what would actually happen if one man remained on Earth as the last male? This, all of this, without fantasy, without wish fulfillment, the real version. It wouldn't be power, it would be pressure. It wouldn't be fantasy, it would be psychological torture. It wouldn't be freedom, it would be the most constrained existence imaginable. He'd lose autonomy, privacy, ability to form genuine human connections, sense of self beyond biological function. Everything making life worth living sacrificed for abstract species survival concept. He'd be civilization's most important person and the most trapped, most valuable and most exploited, most necessary and most alone. He'd watch himself transform from person into symbol, into resource, into piece of historical preservation. His body wouldn't belong to him. His genetic material would be species property. His life devoted entirely to one function. Nothing else would matter. But here's the final reality making this thought experiment truly dark. The sperm banks. Because here's what would actually happen with global distribution over 40 years. His genetic material wouldn't just father thousands. It would father millions, maybe tens of millions. By year 40, the numbers would be staggering. Conservative estimates would put his biological offspring at 5 to 8 million people. Roughly 10 to 15% of all humans born since the vanishing. In some countries using only his genetic material before stem cell methods became available, percentages much higher, maybe 30 to 40%. That means the next generation wouldn't just include some of his children, it would be substantially composed of his descendants. And their children would be his grandchildren. And their children his great-grandchildren. Within a century, assuming population growth resumed, he could have descendants numbering in hundreds of millions. Within 2 centuries, billions. His genetic code spread across the entire species, literally repopulating humanity. He wouldn't just be the last man of the old world. He'd be the genetic father of the new world. His DNA in billions of people, his face visible in millions of descendants, his genetic legacy permanent and inescapable. And he'd have to live with that knowledge, that because he surrendered, because he cooperated, because he let them use his body to preserve the species, humanity continues. But that continuation means he's genetically related to nearly everyone alive. He'd be the most successful human in terms of genetic propagation in all history. More descendants than Genghis Khan. More genetic legacy than anyone who ever lived. His genes in billions of people across hundreds of generations. But he'd have accomplished this through complete loss of autonomy, through reduction to biological function, through being used as resource rather than respected as person. That's what would actually happen if one man remained as the last male on Earth. Not fantasy, not power, just the strange, heavy, inescapable reality of being the bridge between the world that was and the world that is. The last man, the first father of the new humanity, trapped, alone, necessary, used, important, exploited, all of it simultaneously forever. And humanity continues, thanks to him, thanks to his genetic material distributed worldwide, thanks to sperm banks operating for decades, the entire next generation carrying his DNA, the species surviving, the future secured. That's the reality, not the fantasy version, the real version, the end.